The PlayStation 1 is one of the best-selling game consoles of all time, topping 100 million units and burying its direct competitors the Sega Saturn and the Nintendo 64. And alongside iconic franchises like Crash Bandicoot, Metal Gear Solid, and Gran Turismo, it also introduced something else to the world that remains burned into the consciousness of millions: the PS1 startup sound. In the early 1990s, the video game industry was dominated by two major Japanese forces, Sega and Nintendo, driven in part by the economic boom in Japan in the 1980s, as well as the crash of the video game market in the US in the mid-80s, leading to the decline of the most prominent console manufacturers like Atari. Sony, meanwhile, didn't really have plans to make their own console, instead focusing on the consumer electronics products that had made them a household name, like the Walkman, and their contributions to the development of the CD. They did, however, still want a piece of the video game market, and provided the audio chip for Nintendo's second console, the Super Nintendo, also known as the SNES. But little did they know that they would soon be going from partners with Nintendo to fierce rivals. The CD had become the most popular format for music by the end of the 80s, and CD-ROM drives had started to appear in personal computers as well. The tide was shifting away from cartridge-based consoles, and bolstered by their successful partnership on the SNES audio chip, Sony and Nintendo decided to develop an add-on for the SNES that could utilize this new, promising format. This new device, dubbed the Nintendo Playstation, was worked on for several years and was focused on non-gaming software, like encyclopedias and karaoke software. But as the launch got closer, Nintendo started to get spooked. They realized that the contract they had signed meant that if gaming off CD-ROMs became a thing, they wouldn't make any money off of it. They quickly made a deal with Philips instead, and never told Sony. And in one of the more legendary events in the history of the video game industry, they announced in a presentation at CES 1991 that they would not be partnering with Sony, but with Philips instead. Ken Kutaragi, the man who designed the SNES audio chip and made the deal for the Nintendo PlayStation, saw this as the ultimate betrayal, and eventually convinced the slightly skeptical Sony board that they should directly attack Nintendo by releasing their own console. The PlayStation 1 was eventually released at the end of 1994. Another man, sound engineer Takafumi Fujisawa, had been brought onto the PlayStation team from the start and was tasked with creating the PS1 startup sound. Having been close to the development of the console, he was familiar with its hardware capabilities and constraints, and was also essentially given free rein to compose any sound that he wanted. His first demo was ultimately accepted, although he says he had an alternative version with him whispering PlayStation over the top of it, which doesn't sound a million miles away from the sound used at the end of PlayStation commercials years later, voiced by musician Minekawa Takako. But the PS1 sound is much more than just a simple sound for aesthetics, and there are many factors and decisions that went into it. So let's take a look at some of them and see how they shape the final results. First, let's talk about why there needed to be a startup screen and accompanying sound in the first place. As mentioned earlier, there was a shift at the time away from cartridges and towards CD-ROMs. CD-ROMs were the newer technology. They were much cheaper to produce and also provided around 10 times the storage of cartridges, which meant that richer and more complex games could be produced. But one of the downsides was the slower load times, which could average 5 to 10 seconds due to the delay of finding the right sector on the disc, compared to the sub 1 second load times of cartridges, which were inserted directly into the circuitry of the console. The Nintendo 64, for example, the last major console to use cartridge-based systems, didn't have a console-specific loading screen, but Sony realized that they couldn't have a blank screen for 10 seconds while the game loaded, so the startup screen served to disguise these slower loading times. But Fujisawa wanted to turn this limitation into an opportunity, readying the user with some musical tricks, showing off the console's capabilities, as well as adding the ability to diagnose when something has gone wrong, which we'll get into shortly. He devised the sound as a journey, and the first part is intended to convey a sense of security to the user. The first bass chord fades in gradually, which Fujisawa notes is in order not to scare the user. The second chord completes what's called a perfect cadence in music, which to our ears provides a sense of resolution and finality, and makes things feel stable, and is one of the most common ways to end a piece of music. This part is also using equal temperament, the most common tuning system in modern-day music, and one that feels very familiar to our ears, further adding to the stability that Fujisawa wanted to convey. And for you synth geeks out there, the bass notes were likely created with a preset called Spacious Sweep on the Roland D50.
Did any of you ever own a Sony Playstation? Just the D50 factory patch.
Now, in contrast, the end part is meant to provide excitement for what's to come. Fujisawa opted here instead to use a different tuning system called just intonation, which is sometimes said to sound more pure and exciting to our ears, partly due to the frequency ratios between notes, but probably partly because these days we don't often listen to music tuned in that way. The THX sound is another sound logo that uses just intonation to give a sense of excitement to the viewer. And Fujisawa claims that he wanted the sound to recreate the feeling of walking into a cinema, so there's a chance that he was at least partly influenced by it. He also opts to use a combination of high twinkly bells, again for excitement, and some low bells playing what's called a suspended fourth chord. This is not a dissonant sounding chord, but it's one that wants to resolve to a more stable chord. So by fading this out and leaving it open-ended, he's leaving the user in a sense of anticipation, both musically and symbolically, for the game that's about to start. And now the middle part, which is arguably the most interesting part. As the synth chord from the first part rings on, there's a swoosh sound that occurs in time with the PlayStation logo, just before the twinkly bells. This is actually a reverse sample of some glass breaking. And as well as providing a mental break between the first and second parts, the fact that this sound plays signals to the user or the developer that the disc was read correctly. And that's because of the amazing fact that the PS1 sound is not actually just a pre-rendered audio file as played, but in fact it generates the sound in real time, similar to the way that the THX sound was created. The sound is made up of just 3 sounds: the glass breaking sound, a bell sample, and the bass synth. And all the reverb, panning, and timed playback is done via the sound chip. Pretty amazing. Now, I said that the glass sound only plays if the disc is read correctly. But what if it's not? Well, people have figured out exactly how to access these error states in the 30+ years that the PS1 has been a thing, and they even have specific names. Here are 2 of the most notable ones. The first, called Fearful Harmony, involves a slightly distorted version of the glass sound, followed by a transition to a glitched version of the PlayStation logo. After a little while, the chime sample starts playing repeatedly and gets higher and higher. I won't play the whole thing as it's quite long, but here is a taster. And the second is called Personified Fear, a state where the PlayStation logo stays on screen for a bit longer than usual, followed by a rather dissonant rendition of the glass breaking sound, cutting to a grey screen. Both of these are just in that uncanny valley range where it's close to the original but things are slightly off, so they're generally considered to be rather creepy, especially for unsuspecting kids. Nevertheless, this demonstrates the real-time nature of the startup sound that's able to adapt to other inputs from the system. The sound did an incredible job of maximizing the available hardware constraints while also setting the user's expectations, and still being memorable 30+ years later. Fujisawa was later rehired to work on the PlayStation 2 sound, this time with a different brief and a team behind him. But that's a story for another video. If you enjoyed this, you can check out our other videos over here. You can support us on Patreon to keep the channel going, or you can come join our Discord. The links are in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Mixed Signals. Bye bye.